afternoon, friends. I've been asked to facilitate this meeting. My name is Joe Camilleri, and I'm a retired academic from the Crossroads University, and I convene a group initiative called Conversation with the Crossroads. I'm delighted to be here, and in welcoming you all, let me, as is our custom, acknowledge and pay respect to the First Nations on whose traditional land we meet today. I acknowledge them as the custodians of the earth and of all things that grow and breathe in the soil. We thank them for passing their wisdom and heritage to all of us since the dawn. We acknowledge the wrongs done to them by newcomers to this land, and we seek to be partners with them in righting these wrongs and in living together in peace and harmony with them and with the land, our common home. We look forward to the day when Australia will listen carefully to their voice, respect their wisdom, formally recognize the sovereignty they never see, and extend to them the justice long overdue. Well, as you all know, we are here today to discuss an issue or set of issues of great importance, not only, of course, to those who live in Sri Lanka, but to the large diaspora, the large Sri Lankan diaspora in Australia, as well as in many other countries. And it is in any case an issue of concern to other countries in the region, and not least Australia. As I think many of us know, Sri Lanka is a wonderful country, rich in history, that has gone through difficult times. And the question, I suppose, we're all interested to know is whether there is a light at the end of the tunnel, whether there are any obstacles along the way, and whether we can see a time when we will reach the light, long overdue, after many troubling years in the recent history of Sri Lanka. And hopefully we will also hear if there are obstacles, we might be able to overcome. Okay, so we're going to hear from 4 speakers, but before I pass on to introduce the first speaker, I would like to make sure that our 3 other speakers are with us because they're joining us via Zoom. Janaka Bianwilla, are you there? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Yes?
That's weird.
Okay. And I know that the other 2 are here. Thank you. Could I ask everyone who is joining us on Zoom to please mute yourselves so that we can have a very clear hearing of what everyone is saying, and that the recording comes through loud and clear. The event is being recorded and no doubt will be made available sometime after the event. Well, let me begin by inviting our first speaker to share something of his great knowledge and understanding of the background to all this. Michael Cook is a retired public servant, trade union activist, who has a lifelong interest in South Asian history. He has served as an election monitor in Sri Lanka and penned, when the occasion required, several articles and monographs, as well as book and film reviews. He's the author of the Lionel Burpage story. Michael.
All right, before I start my talk called Oppression and Resistance, I want to acknowledge that they live on the stolen land of the Kulin Nation, that their sovereignty over country was never ceded, and that colonialization is an ongoing process. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and commit, like you all, to the struggle for a treaty and justice with First Nations people. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now to get back to my talk called Oppression and Resistance. A good place to start is on the dialectic of resistance and oppression is the Great Rebellion of 1816, year after the triumphant proclamation by the British that the island was theirs. Rebellion largely took place in the poorer provinces of the Kandy Kingdom. The catalyst was the appearance of a pretender to the throne, a Sinhalese monk posing as a Tamil-speaking Hindu king, a claim tellingly made at the ecumenical shrine of Karagamma, and propelled by the unbearable revenue and labor obligations imposed on the peasantry. Resistance erupted, British heads began to appear on stakes, and 16,000 warriors descended from the hills. British reaction was a scorched earth policy. It was supported by a large majority of the Kandyan nobility. Their death toll was large, between 10,000 to 15,000 out of a population of around 100,000. The next incident I want to discuss is the general strike of 1923. In 1918 and 1919, the rice crop in India failed. Exacerbating this was the disturbance of transport caused by the First World War. A shipping shortage ensued, making transportation and rice from other sources almost impossible. Prices shot up as a result. On 20th of March 1920, newspapers reported people dying of starvation on the streets. The number of beggars had also noticeably increased, and many of those deemed the respectable poor were surviving on a meal a day. Workers working on the railway and ancillary industries demanded a 30% wage increase to offset the rise in the price of rice. The government's solution was to let the market work its magic, i.e. make the workers bear the brunt. The strikers were led by one of their own class, Marshal Vikramasinghe, a former fitter. This defiance fired up the Colombo port workers. 5,000 went on strike. This proletarian unity surprised the elite and worried them as the workers' collective strike action threatened to bring down the economy. The colonial government, private employees, and contractors were forced to the negotiating table. A compromise was worked out, and the workers were given a wage increase. Some of the employees later reneged, claiming that workers on ships and lighterman boats were excluded. A second strike forced them to change their minds. This was the birth of the Sri Lankan trade union movement. Next one I want to talk about is about 20 years later, is the malarial epidemic. The devastating effect of the Great Depression resulted in the export of tea, rubber, and coconut products bottoming out, resulting in mass unemployment, with the situation made worse by drought and the resulting famine. In 1934 and 1935, the usual rains did not arrive, and in many districts the paddy crop failed. The shortfall of the 1934 paddy crop was estimated to be a staggering 3 million bushels. Malnutrition and virus were a fatal combination. Severe bus epidemic was observed in many provinces, making food shortages even more acute. Credible estimates put the death toll between 125,000 and 180,000, a staggering death toll in a country of 5.5 million people, of whom 1.5 million were affected by the epidemic. Earlier, the colonial government, with the approval of most of the elected representatives of the State Council, passed regressive taxes on vital consumer goods, the argument being they were temporary and can be lifted once the economic slump ended. It will not explain how the poor people who could hardly feed and shelter themselves were expected to pay. This has resonance to the current situation in the country. And next, I want to jump a few decades to the 1955 Hattal. In 1948, 40% of the gross domestic product came from agriculture, with plantation crops accounting for no more than half. Yet foodstuffs accounted for 52% of imports because of the gross utilization of land and labor. The plantation sector, by the time of independence, reached its limits in terms of acreage. The price of the produce of these plantations was declining. The workers were exploited by a parasitic urban middle class living off the fruits of their labor. The boom caused by the Korean War collapsed the prices in the early 50s. The UNP government decided to cut welfare for those who could least afford it and leave untouched the bulging pockets of their backers, the elite. The architect of this austerity package was JR. The left and trade union movement called the Vande Hartal, i.e. a general strike to stop all commercial activities on the island, and the LSSP took a leading role in organizing it. The other left-wing parties and trade unions either supported or sympathized with the strike action. Rural workers also took part in the struggle, hand in hand with their urban comrade. For the first time in the history of the island, the workers united with the peasants against capitalism and brought the country to a standstill demanding their rights. The government panicked and capitulated. Mysteriously, the organizers of the Hartal did not push for a fairer tax and economic system and called off the struggle, something the country is still coming to terms with. Now I want to discuss the 1971 insurrection. Not so much the reasons for it, but the economic background to it. The argument of whether the insurrection should have happened or shouldn't have happened is a discussion for another day. The 1960s experienced declining export prices and rising export costs. In 1970, Ceylon spent more importing chilies than it earned from tourism. It's sobering to think that in 1971, foodstuffs made 53% of imports. According to figures released by the Central Bank of Ceylon, the country's foreign debt in 1955 was 205 million. By 1969, it was 1,375 million. In 1946, the population of Ceylon was 6.6 million. By 1970, it almost doubled to 12.5 million. The country had impressive literacy rates, 80%, second only to Japan. Every year, 100,000 new school leavers entered an already overcrowded job market. Per capita income in 1971 was a lowly 132. But crucially, for why the insurrection took place, it's important to understand that the labor force of 4.4 million, 585,000 were officially unemployed. And Pereira, the economic czar of the United Front government, estimated the figure to be closer to 700,000. Crucial given the cadre and leadership base of the JVP, out of the 585,000 unemployed, 460,000 were in the rural areas and 250,000 were aged from 19 to 24. 167,000 of these received a secondary or tertiary education. So the singular children of 1956 were not getting the fruits promised to them. Something had to give. An insurrection ensued with between 10,000 and 15,000 deaths and the beginnings of an authoritarian, opaque, non-accountable elite. Now I want to jump to the 1983 pogrom, in which 3,000 Tamils were brutally killed, thousands of women were raped, property was looted, burnt, and confiscated, and 200,000 were forced to flee to the north and to Tamil Nadu in India. At the time of the pogrom, only 6% of Tamils were employed in the public sector. Sinhalese represented 75% of the population and 85% of all public service jobs, 82% of all technical and professional positions, and 82% of all managerial and administrative appointments. JR shut down government enterprises and broke the civil service to unleash the country's capitalist beast. The beast began to look for scapegoats. Many singular business people eyed Tamil traders in Petta, the market district in Colombo, with undisguised resentment. And a week into the pogrom, many of these businesses were looted, the government passing legislation ruling out compensation and to forcibly requisition Tamil property. And aside, as a result of an unwarranted and horrific rise in 1977, the government of JR passed the Indemnity Act, which gave ministers, bureaucrats, and security forces indemnity for the acts of communal violence. For a more detailed account of this, I draw your attention to Dr. Newton Guzasinghe's article, The Open Economy and Its Impact on Ethnic Relations in Sri Lanka. Now, I want to now turn my gaze towards the present. This untenable economic system and its relations of production lurched along and was eulogized by the political elite and the faithful organic intellectuals who prophesied that the country would have the GDP and social indices of Europe. Social inequality was still at its core, with the top 20% enjoying 42% of the economic cake, and the lowest 40% making do with 70.85%. yet the debt spree continued. In 2010, the debt ratio was 75% of GDP. In 2018, 84%. In 2020, it jumped to 101%. The debt cannot be repaid under the current economic model based on a low tax base, corruption, incompetence, and greed, feeding off remittances, tourism, tea, and the garment industry. Radical economic and class solution is needed. COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine resulted in an increase in the price of exports and put a damper on the garments, remittances, and tourism products. And tourism also collapsed after the Easter bombing, making an acute debt crisis catastrophic. Thinking this is the way modernity, capitalism was brutally introduced. Sorry, I'll go back. In conclusion, what I'm trying to show is the way that capitalism was brutally introduced by the colonialists and the way the business and political elite carried on with a few interruptions with the same inequitable model of mercantilism and the plantation economy, ideologically glued by self-serving, arrogant, and corrupt elite. This is ongoing mess which the NPP government inherited. How it might be resolved is a $4 million question, in which my more erudite presenters will be discussing.
Thank you very much, Michael, for placing the current corruption, incompetence, and greed back until recently in historical perspective. We'll come back to causes and solutions. Now, I'd like to call on our next speaker, Dissanayake, independent researcher with a focus on labor relations, social movements, civil society, gender, and activism. His work in the NGO sector in Sri Lanka and as a lecturer at the University of Western Australia, as well as the University of New South Wales. He has completed as a springboard diver and represented Sri Lanka at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. He's the author of Debt Crisis and Popular Social Protest in Sri Lanka, Citizenship, Development, and Democracy within Global North-South Dynamics. It's a great pleasure to invite you to address us.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes? Okay. Okay. So I will kind of talk mostly about the current government, the NPP, coming into power. And I will particularly use the 2022 popular uprising as a historical moment in the shift of local politics. I think what we are going through is a democratic transition in Sri Lanka, and it's a very complex process. And I would look at the process of democratization in three different realms of politics. And I would, these three categories are politics of representation, politics of redistribution, and politics of recognition. So the politics of recognition is about ethno-nationalism and how we're going to move forward to establish a much more democratic society that recognizes multi-ethnic, multi-religious character of the society in Sri Lanka. In terms of politics of redistribution, I think Michael already talked about social inequality and how that has increased. And there's a real need to redistribute countries' resources much more in an egalitarian way to create the conditions so people can participate in a democratic society. The third one is politics of representation. And this is where the issue of national question, party politics, all come into play. Particularly in terms of the national question, as Michael already touched on, we are dealing with an ethno-nationalist singular Buddhist nation state that has been entrenched since independence, but particularly since 1956, then again reinforced in 1972 by making Buddhism, giving Buddhism privileged status within the constitution. And we have gone through a 30-year civil war and an internal insurrection, all within this politics of the national question about ethno-nationalism. So going forward, we really have to have that conversation. What kind of a nation state, what kind of nationhood are we going to create in this process of democratic transition? So in terms of politics of redistribution, in terms of the economy, we have essentially, in the post-war period, which is 2009, has essentially followed a similar path as most other countries in the global south, which is an economy that is incapable of creating meaningful, stable jobs with a living wage. Now, this is the crisis, the economic crisis the NPP has to deal with. What kind of jobs can we create? How can we, these jobs, create some certainty in people's lives and give them a sense of belonging? And how does these jobs relate to improving the local economies? So in terms of an economic policy project, the NPP is pretty much wedded to the neoliberal agenda, which has essentially based itself on the export economy, but also on remittances and tourism. Now, both these aspects or these sectors are very unstable. Tourism is seasonal. It only affects a particular regional areas. And remittances, and we are still dealing mostly with the export of lower skilled wage labor, mostly women, into the Middle East countries as domestic workers. Now, in terms of the labor market in Sri Lanka, the NPP has a real challenge in trying to regulate the labor market that has been deregulated since 1977. What I mean by regulation is enabling workers to organize within workplaces and creating conditions for collective agreements. So in terms of the trade union movement, most of the trade union movement is concentrated in the public sector, and the private sector unionization is less than 8%, I would say, at the moment. And the largest segment of the organized workers are in the tea plantations, which is the most poverty-ridden labor sector and the most important sector in terms of the export economy of the country. So there's a real need to address what's happening in the plantations, because these conditions of bonded labor in the plantations and cultural marginalization continues without much structural changes at the bottom. So the NPP has a real challenge in trying to intervene on improving the working conditions and living conditions of those plantation workers. The other major aspect is trying to create conditions to regulate the labor market so we reduce the size of the informal sector. The informal sector has grown in the last 50 years, and this has also meant workers are less capable of organizing to demand better wages and working conditions. So these are the ways in which wealth has essentially, rather than trickling down, has trickled up or actually gushed up to the elite segments of the elite classes in Sri Lanka. So there's a real need to think about the labor markets, how we're going to regulate the labor markets, and how to localize them, how to embed these labor markets in local economies, by which I mean is creating local jobs that are engaged with the local economy in a ways to create conditions so the local economy benefits in the first place. In terms of the national question, the issue is directly relates to reforming the constitution. We have a presidential constitution, and the NPP has verbally sort of expressed its agenda to abolish the executive presidency. And this is a very important step in democratizing the realm of representative politics. Along with that aspect of uh, abolishing the executive presidency, there's a real need to have a conversation around devolution and decentralization of the state, which is about federalism. We need to start that conversation around federalism and how we are especially going to deal with the North and the Eastern provinces in terms of enabling those provinces to have some sense of autonomy to decide their own political and economic and cultural self-determination. The key issue there is the militarization of the state. Over the past 50 years, we have built a huge militarized state. When I say militarized state, what I mean is we want to be aware of how much the military is actually embedded with civil society now. The military is engaged in cultural activities. The military is engaged in sports activities. The military is engaged in a whole range of other state activities that creates conditions where the military has become a key source of employment for addressing rural unemployment. And because of this militarization, the way the North and the East are essentially still under military control. There's a real need to address that issue of withdrawing the military from these areas and somehow demilitarization in a process where you actually create jobs for the rural youth, because there's a real need for that. So this is going to be a key aspect of politics of representation and politics of recognition. In terms of politics of recognition, there's a real need to rethink how we can start having that conversation around a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society and the ways in which the state needs to back off, or the state needs to reconfigure its relationship with the Sinhala Buddhist ethno-nationalist groupings, because these groupings have been reinforced, particularly since the post-war period, since 2009. And even though the NPP came on a much more multi-ethnic, multi-religious agenda, these ethno-nationalist forces are still very active and very much linked with the elite project of undermining the NPP in multiple ways. So at the moment, the conversation is that the NPP is not doing enough. The NPP hasn't lived up to its policy agenda. So there's all kinds of criticisms about the NPP. And there's some of those criticisms is justified, because this we have to understand in terms of complexity of governance and the governance of complexity, because the state is a multi-tiered, diverse institution, and there are multiple complex relationships that are happening within the state. So the ways in which the NPP is trying to transform the state, it's at multiple levels, in multiple scales, in multiple timeframes. So it's a very complex process, and the importance of social movements is significant for this process. The general tendency is to see the NPP project as a top-down project, but the NPP came to power on a much more broad-based social movement. And building those social movements is imperative to maintain this democratic transition. Now, this goes to the heart of JVP's trade union movement, which has maintained a fairly segregationist, isolationist, almost dominating tendencies within the labor movement, because the labor movement is much more diverse. There are multiple actors in it, and there are much more democratic elements within the labor movement. And there's a real need to JVP to have that the JVP to have that conversation with multiple actors within the labor movement to strengthen the labor movement going forward. So in terms of just to summarize, I think we need to think of the NPP in terms of in which ways are they trying to change politics of redistribution? In which ways are they trying to change politics of representation? And which ways are they trying to change politics of recognition? So these three aspects, these are actually categories used by a theoretician named Nancy Fraser, talking about justice. And I think it'll be useful if you start thinking about democracy in those terms. And with that, I'll start my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janaka, for this fascinating introduction. Yes. Oh, okay. Thank you for your fascinating presentation and the three key ideas you put before us of representation, redistribution, and recognition. I'm sure we'll come back to them in discussion shortly. Thank you. Let me now turn to our next speaker, Manoranjan Selya, a veteran journalist who witnessed firsthand the violence against Tamils during the 77 riots, followed by the 83 Black July riots, violence committed against the Muslim community in the north and east, the LTTE's brutal annihilation of its political opponents. And all through this, he was buoyed by the goodwill, the courage displayed by Tamils, Muslims, and Sinhalese against these unspeakable authorities. It has coloured life as an activist, a writer, and a journalist, and we have great pleasure in inviting you to speak to us. Thank you.
Distinguished Chair, organizers, and dear colleagues, I thank you for offering me this valuable opportunity to share my thoughts on the assigned topic. The portion I am supposed to deal with is how the new NPP government should approach or address the national question or the ethnic question in Sri Lanka. Mr. Bianwala partially addressed that. I mostly agree and endorse about his observation, how this whole national question or the ethnic question, the root causes, and what's the situation now in the north and the east. But as we are all talking, the post-Aragalaya and the post-NPP victory scenario, for me, the Aragalaya, the people's uprising, is the most bold and beautiful act at that moment of Sri Lankan civil politics. We are lucky and we are fortunate that it happened during our time. From my point of view, the Aragalaya, the people's uprising, is a wake-up call for the Sinhala, or not the Sinhala, the Sri Lankan polity. I mean, not the politicians, to the entire Sri Lankan political society, whether it's Tamils, Sinhalese, Muslims, or anybody else. Because we are part and parcel of creating these political leaders and bringing these political entities to power since independence. We voted for them to victory, armed them with all powers, and allowed them to rule us as they wanted. What was the result? What's the outcome is history that we know. That's why, for me, the Aragalaya was a wake-up call for us. We all yearned for a change. We loudly announced, enough is enough. We boldly came forward to denounce the past. The change what we wanted is not just an external change. It's a change within ourselves. That's what I feel. That's why I supported the Aragalaya movement. And I campaigned for the victory of NPP. Hopefully, Many of my political activist colleagues who are presented now here among this audience, and my fellow speaker, Mr. Lionel, as well. We are from North and the South, two different times. We took up arms, we became militants, but at the Aragalaya, we came together and supported that. I am from Canada and from Australia. So what I actually, the meaning of Aragalaya for me, I just do not want to exclude me from this whole scenario, because I am part of this. That's what I always want to represent. The expectation, the change we shared as Sri Lankan communities, the minority Tamils from the north and the east, the hill country, the upcountry Tamils, the Indian origin Tamils, who overwhelmingly voted for NPP. And furthermore, the Muslims of Sri Lanka, the very first time, they chose NPP as one of their political representatives. So this is a kind of a significant thing that we need to understand. First time in the Sri Lankan history, a single political entity from the south, predominantly Sinhala, secured 150 seats, which is more than 2/3 majority in the parliament, without forming a coalition with any of these regional parties that have represented minorities for many decades. So in this context, in this background, what actually I am trying to look at is, Mr. Bianwal has said the politics of recognition. I would like to say the NPP should think of doing, what is expected from the NPP is to do politics of reconciliation in every sense. Politically, socially, economically, linguistically, you can keep on saying whatever the aspects, we are being torn apart by the 75 years of Sri Lankan politics. So the political reconciliation is the one we were talking about: reforming the constitution, devolving powers, decentralizing powers, and secular constitution, inclusive with all communities, where all communities feel safe and secure as one nation. So that is for that, NPP government required to take bold and transformative steps towards the direction of true political reconciliation. Political reconciliation is the long road that NPP government should walk and lead the country. The end goal of this should be devolving centralized powers to the periphery. So whatever the setup, whether it is to the local government or the provincial councils, whatever the structure, the existing structures has to be strengthened by giving them autonomy and independence to handle their economic, social, political, and cultural, linguistic issues by them. And this that will create a situation or an environment for those citizens to feel their dignity, which is they rightfully deserve, is taken into account. It will reassure them that their aspirations are valued, their culture is respected, and their voices are heard. So I would say the politics of reconciliation should start from every corner, not one after the other. Any policies the government pass, any bills, any reforms, any laws has to be directed with this notion of reconciliation. What we are left with is a sense of revenge, which is right opposite to the reconciliation. For me, revenge is a kind of what you call, it's a lazy form of grief for our losses. Reconciliation is a kind of active, creative way of grieving. So the word reconciliation has to be the main motive or the main motto of the NPP government in every aspect. For the reconciliation in Sri Lanka, if you take the majority and the minority, the reconciliation should start in every level. The wounds are so deep, we have hurt ourselves. In a way, in the civil war, we have witnessed the government, the unleashed government, the state brutality in its fullest extent, which created a ground for us to create our own brutality, our internal brutality, which we have never expected and experienced. And that has destroyed the same goal what we were thinking that we are fighting for. The Tamils are an independent nation, Tamils as a community. What the end of 30 years of civil war, what the destruction within ourselves is much more than the destruction what actually we got from outside. So the healing has to take place from all sides. We have hurt ourselves. The Sinhalese have killed the Tamils. Tamils have killed the Sinhalese. Tamils have killed the Tamils. Tamils have killed the Muslims. North attacked the East. East attacked the North. So where to start this reconciliation? Where to face the truth is, and how to start is the biggest challenge, not only for the NPP government, it's the biggest challenge for us as well. At least during the past 6 months of NPP rule, we can see the communities are able to talk about it without fear, without being monitored, without being arrested, or without being penalized by the government. The communities are able to talk about the past, at least to revisit the past and face the truth. So talk about Batalanda, talk about Mullivaikal, talk about Wakarai, talk about what happened to the Muslims in the north. All these issues has to be brought up and be able to discuss or sit down and talk. An environment should be created by the government for this reconciliation process to start. So for me, the NPP government should start doing the politics of reconciliation on all aspects. That's my point of view, and I still believe in Sri Lankan reconciliation process, the Buddhism can play a biggest role in a positive manner, whereas the Buddhist monks who are being silenced by the Buddhist forces in action along with the government, the past government, there are a huge number of Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka who have the potential of guiding and helping this whole reconciliation process as the Christian church did in South Africa. With that, I conclude my thoughts, open for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Note of appreciation for bringing reconciliation to the fore and for suggesting that it holds the key to transformative change in Sri Lanka. And we might explore in a while what that might mean in practice a little more in depth. Okay, we now come to the fourth and last speaker, someone I know quite well, Lionel Burpage, a veteran human rights campaigner and advocate for good governance and transparency in government. He has worked tirelessly campaigning to abolish the executive presidency and to change the Sri Lankan constitution in more democratic direction. He resigned as secretary of the JVP in the 80s, was jailed a number of times for his advocacy and agitation for a more inclusive and economic fair Sri Lankan society. In Australia, he played a key role in forming organisations, staging forums and other events with a view to fostering a more civil dialogue between different elements of the diverse Sri Lankan community here. And we appreciate that, and we are pleased that you will be able to speak to us now.
Thank you, Professor Camilleri. Aiboan, Vanakkam, Assalamu alaikum, and greetings to all. First of all, I would like to apologize for not being able to be physically present due to my health condition. I acknowledge that our discussion occurs on the traditional lands of the first Australians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of this land. We pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and the elders of other communities. The substantial mandate granted to the new NPP government in Sri Lanka reflects the aspirations of Sri Lankans for a better future and their disappointment with the shortcomings of previous regimes. The path ahead is challenging. Success will depend on the implementation of the promised social democratic agenda. Achieving the systemic change envisioned by the Aragalaya campaign demands dedication and sacrifice of the politicians, the bureaucracy, and the people, and is crucial for building a just and equitable future. The global economic environment is undergoing a paradigm shift due to geopolitical rivalry and the disruption caused by the US resetting its entire agenda. National security has taken precedence over global economic governance, marking the end of the neoliberal globalization era. Measures, measures such as tariffs are being reintroduced to control trade, technology, and investment flows. In this environment, the security state dominates the market, shifting the emphasis from cost efficiency to economic resilience and security. This focus on economic security requires the state to assert control over private technology transfer and investment and to incentivize the relocation of critical industries closer to domestic territories. In this new geopolitical environment, would the social democratic economic model become the norm in the post globalization era? Would the current geoeconomic disruptions undermine export oriented models that rely on competitive advantage? The new NPP government wants to break the cycle of corruption and inefficiency that was prevalent under the previous regimes, indicating the new government's integrity and moral determination. This positive development is encouraging, despite the government's inexperience and some clumsy ways of handling deep rooted challenges. For economic recovery, the government needs to establish a shared vision for the future. Its approach to debt management will also influence the country's geopolitical standing and social stability. By combining fiscal discipline with innovative revenue strategies and strong governance reforms, the government can redefine the economic narrative. This will include attracting foreign investment, including from the diaspora, rebuilding trust in financial institutions, implementing systemic transparency and accountability reforms, and ensuring the ongoing welfare of citizens. For example, a public private partnership co financed by Tamil diaspora business leaders could facilitate a phased expansion of the Jaffna International Airport into a thriving international hub, bringing much needed foreign exchange for economic revitalization. Addressing immediate crisis while laying the foundation for long-term economic stability and prosperity is essential. Ongoing reforms and debt restructuring are essential for achieving long-term stability and promoting inclusive growth. The government must prioritize revenue mobilization, social spending, and social safety net reforms while addressing challenges relating to debt sustainability and the outflow of skilled professionals. Other key priorities include implementing governance reforms, fostering social cohesion, empowering civil society, particularly the youth, and maintaining a balanced foreign policy. If unsuccessful, the situation could be disastrous. At the same time, implementing tumultuous change may alienate friends and allies, leading to a political stalemate, a right wing backlash, or an authoritarian capitalist setup. The rise of authoritarian capitalism, accompanied by majoritarian communalism, could tear the social fabric apart. The government's agenda needs to broker the social compromises needed to build a broad cross-sectional alliance for structural change. The NPP's agenda seeks a peaceful transition through established political processes, differing from traditional Marxism, which anticipates the collapse of capitalism. Realpolitik suggests that capitalism adopts various forms, such as imperialism and neoliberalism, and currently seen in authoritarian capitalism and figures like Donald Trump. This approach is rooted in populism, often proposing simplistic and draconian nationalist solutions to issues. Authoritarian capitalism could lead to global economic slowdowns and geopolitical tensions, potentially impacting Sri Lanka's future prospects. Domestically, resistance to reform and social unrest could hinder the inclusive growth needed to reduce inequality and support economic recovery. Historically, developing countries have attracted investment and boosted exports by leveraging cheap labor, fostering growth. However, automation and digitization are diminishing this advantage. In response, Sri Lanka's government has shifted its focus, while other nations are nearshoring manufacturing operations to enhance their resilience. The transition from authoritarianism to participatory capitalism is complex and it needs time. The future ultimately lies in a socially owned economy based on economic and workplace democracy with employee self management at its heart. The NPP government aims to create a just and equitable future. Despite a progressive political agenda, the government faces opposition from entrenched state practices, corrupt traditions, and a politicized and inefficient bureaucracy reliant on political orders. The center left government has been in power for approximately 125 days and faces challenges adapting a new and better work culture within a coalition framework. This requires compromises, including acknowledging the plurality of Sri Lankan society, which consists of a majority of Sinhala Buddhists. In this context, a coalition work culture demands recognition of diverse perspectives, building consensus through inclusive processes, and following a pragmatic path as outlined in the NPP program, A Thriving Nation and a Beautiful Life. Consensus building involves effectively communicating with all communities to foster confidence in building a positive future for all. Accountability for past injustices remain unresolved. The Aragalaya campaign called for democratic reforms, an end to corruption, and accountability. Even 15 years after the end of the civil war, victims, their families, and those who suffered severe collateral damages are still waiting for the truth, justice, and reparation. The last 7 decades witnessed enforced disappearances of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands were killed, and their bodies were disposed of with no postmortems. Due to the impunity granted to the perpetrators, no satisfactory and meaningful progress has been achieved so far. The government needs to make all the necessary changes to ensure accountability and justice for the wrongs done in the past. The government's position regarding the full implementation of the nearly 4 decades old 13th Amendment to the Constitution still lacks clarity. A comprehensive policy framework that ensures dignity, equality, and economic development for marginalized communities while respecting their cultural identities is needed to address the national question. Equal citizenship and a shared economy for all are crucial in this regard. In Sri Lanka, identity politics could deepen cultural divides, marginalizing smaller communities and threatening democracy, which may lead to poverty and internal conflicts, favoring right wing politics and authoritarianism. To prevent this, the government needs to adopt an inclusive social democratic agenda that promotes equal rights and opportunities. Economic growth depends on developing startups in agriculture, manufacturing, and services using advanced technologies and skills. Appropriately addressing industrialization, power generation, and export strategies is crucial to avoid issues like environmental pollution. Social welfare programs need to be better targeted. Law enforcement faces scrutiny due to recent custodial deaths. Renewable energy development appears to have lagged, with a costly and risky future option of nuclear energy being explored. The continuation of previous solar projects from 1994 onwards might have made Sri Lanka less reliant on expensive, polluting, non-renewable energy sources. Skilled professionals leaving the country may slow down as the economy strengthens. Attracting the diaspora requires developing favorable social, political, and economic conditions. The government shows promise in addressing citizens' needs and concerns. In conclusion, Sri Lanka's future hinges on ending discrimination and violence and pursuing an inclusive path for all. For that, an inclusive national vision should address socio-economic and cultural conflicts, strengthening democracy, justice, accountability, and reconciliation. The world, including Sri Lanka, is still at crossroads. We owe it to those who agitated, struggled, and sacrificed their lives for a better world to remember their battles and to learn from them to build a more equitable and socially inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you, Lionel. You painted a very broad and daunting agenda for Sri Lanka in very difficult conditions, both local, national, and international. Okay, well, now we've heard from our four speakers. What I would like us now to do is I'm going to try and engage them a little bit in conversation around one or two issues, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A. Let me begin with this question to all of you. You collectively and individually, all four, have painted a very, very large agenda for a new government. And it sounds daunting and difficult to reconcile with all that has happened over the last several decades. Can we realistically expect a new government with perhaps relatively limited experience to be able to take on such a challenging and daunting agenda and to do it in a reasonable time frame? Where do you see hope in the possibility of addressing such a large transformative agenda as all of you in one way or another have put before us? I leave it to all of you to indicate you're making a contribution and in fact respond to one another's ideas and suggestions. Who would like to begin? Yes, please. I can't see very clearly, so who has their hand up? Please take the floor. Can you see? I can't
see it.
Someone?
Nobody's putting their hand up.
No one.
Who would like to say a word? Yes, please.
Okay. Joseph, as you said, this is a huge, complex issues, what I mentioned earlier, the complexity of governance. And in terms of where's hope, I think one thing we have to recognize is that the elected representatives of the new parliament do not have the same background as the previous parliaments. That means the previous parliaments were mostly made up of businessmen, lawyers, but mostly businessmen background. But this new crowd has a much more socially committed background, and they've come into the parliament and they're learning about statecraft essentially in this process. So I think their commitment to that social justice agenda is where the hope lies. Now, how this might be corrupted or how this might be linked with other misadventures along the way is a whole nother arena. But in terms of the commitment of these new elected parliamentarians is an important aspect of going forward. The other aspect is the voters, because after the Aragalaya, particularly after when the Aragalaya was attacked by the ruling regime, and the reaction of the people indicated that the people are now at a different level of political consciousness. They are now in a mode to recognize that this established party system needs to change. But that conversation hasn't continued in a big way. Now that needs to continue because all these parties are essentially fiefdoms of powerful politicians. They have little democracy within these party structures, little transparency or accountability. So just as we are asking for the state to be transparent and accountable, we need to start asking that these political parties be accountable and transparent. So the change in political parties is an important aspect of going forward, I think, in terms of creating that hope. Finally, I think social movements. This is where I think the social movements are very much engaged in this process. They are much more nuanced. They understand the new government is in a difficult, challenging context. So they have kind of, I would say, reflected much more deeply about engaging in contentious collective action. So yeah, I think the NPP will be held in check by these social movements, particularly the labor movement, the women's movement, and the movement for justice in the North and the East. I think those movements will keep the NPP on track in terms of addressing those promised policy changes. I will stop there.
Let's hear from the other speakers. Who will go next? Michael, do you want to say something?
Look, I can't talk about precise micro issues, but there's two issues. If they're not tackled incrementally now, it's going to have a rolling effect later.
Yeah,
but the people in marketing here, people are can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Get closer. Okay, I hate this. Now, people in the north have pressing issues, right?
Just get closer.
Because we've got 60 to 80,000 armed troops in an area the size of from going to Berkeley to Geelong, right? So you got one in every 10 or 12 people who are armed. Whether their presence is overt or covert, it's there, right? You've got a large group of men who don't speak Tamil, taking over a situation where the people speak Tamil, so it's a power of able. The other thing is the army has become an economic player in the area. Now, they run resorts, they run golf courses, they run hotels, they do the market gardening, some of them also running the drug trade. So basically, industry for the local people is non-existent because of it. So the question for the people, and the last issue, and I'd love to speak of it, is about women. There's 90,000 women in the north who are basically without husbands and have equal living, and they're surrounded by a very patriarchal Tamil society and basically young single-age men. So there's a lot of influence, alleged, non-alleged, about assault. I could say more. So there are issues that have to be dealt with, and that is the key issue there is land. Land for the Muslims that the LTT expelled, and land for the Tamils. And it needs to be done incrementally. The other issue is the garments, industry, and remittances are basically women. Women of a certain age who are doing very shit jobs, right? And that are propping up the economy. And it's ripe for abuse, exploitation, etc., etc. Because the remittances, the women that go abroad work as maids in the Middle East, right? So there's been a number of incidences. And the government needs to negotiate to basically not only change the direction of the economy, but to deal with these issues. I think they can deal with these issues. and they have to deal with the issue of the North, of the military and the land. How they do it, they have the goodwill at the moment to do it. And the longer they wait, the longer the goodwill will disappear. Thank you.
Arnold, you want to add something? No? Okay. Well, let me just ask one more question and then we'll open it up. We've heard that it's a massive agenda, so many fronts on which to take initiative. Don't you expect, assuming there is a government, this government, that is prepared to take some initiative, that there will be backlash from powerful interests? Do you expect a strong backlash from these interests, whether they be economic interests, military interests, the interests of the military, whether it be bureaucratic inertia or bureaucratic frustration and even opposition? How do you see? Do you expect any such pushback? And if it is the case, how would a government be placed to counter it and to deal with that? Anyone? Don't be bashful. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think you raised an important issue, Joseph, which is about when there's a popular uprising like this in a South Asian context, which is completely ethno-nationalist and authoritarian state forms. How do you survive is the issue, I think. And this is a really important context in terms of geopolitical alliances and how the NPP government is going to negotiate these geopolitical alliances. Now, India, with its Hindutva project, is a staunchly ethno-nationalist project that is weary of the NPP in that way, because NPP has a much more secular agenda. If you look at Pakistan, even if you look at Bangladesh, the strength of those ethno-nationalist forces in those countries is something that Sri Lanka has to reckon with in terms of building new forms of alliances. Then we have the whole US-China sort of regional and geographic positioning. Within that, I think the NPP is most likely to ally with the Chinese agenda, which allows local development without political interference. Whereas the US and the EU agenda has a much more politically intervening agenda in its historical engagement. So one thing is, how do you negotiate on this regional geopolitics? But the other thing is also the diaspora. The diaspora is also divided. The diaspora that's globally spread out. There are ethno-nationalists, Sinhala Buddhist ethno-nationalists, and Tamil nationalists within this diaspora. And they continue to reinforce those tendencies within their own locales, while there's, I think, the secular diaspora is much more limited. So we need to spread and strengthen those secular voices within the diaspora and to create what Selaya essentially called the politics of reconciliation. Because we need to start having those conversations amongst the diaspora about what a good society might look like in Sri Lanka. So in terms of the backlash, the other key backlash is the internal class politics, because the elites who have essentially benefited from authoritarian ethno-national politics is now in a new context. So they are waiting to see how NPP is going to negotiate a new class compromise, and how this class compromise is not going to cut into their share of profits. So this class politics, a class war from above, is the key challenge that the NPP is facing at the moment. So in order to address that, we need to strengthen the working class and subaltern politics at the bottom to recognize the class politics behind all this. And when we talk about economic development, when we talk about foreign investment, whatever the macroeconomic conversation is, we need to try to link that up with local class politics. And these class politics is not clear. It's very opaque. It's very complex because within each class, there are class factions fighting against each other and also collaborating amongst each other. So I think we need to have much more deeper analytical perspectives on the class politics that's happening, and to be aware that the elite classes are still very much in maintaining their class, are committed to maintaining their class privilege while undermining or restraining democratic shifts. I'll stop at that.
So we can turn to questions from the floor, either online or here in person. Who would like a question of one speaker or more than one speaker? Yes, please.
Here in Australia, there's a lot of Tamils on temporary visas who are very worried that they're going to be sent back to Sri Lanka. So the Australian government, well, has always claimed that Sri Lanka is safe, but now with a new government, they have an additional pretext for saying that Sri Lanka is safe, therefore we can send you back. I just want any comments from any of the speakers about what is the situation in terms of things like arrests, disappearances, torture, and similar phenomena which have occurred in Sri Lanka in the past. Are those phenomena still a thing to worry about for, say, for refugees who are sent back to Sri Lanka? I don't think they should be sent back anyway, because after living here for a decade or more, they should be allowed to stay. But in any case, if there's a real danger of arrest, disappearances and torture, that's an even bigger reason to not send them back.
Who would like to answer the question, which has more of an Australian focus, but asks an important question about the atmosphere back in Sri Lanka and whether governments would be entitled to send back any of our current refugees back to Sri Lanka. Yes.
Can I go?
Yes, please.
This is a very important issue you raised because the issue of disappearances is not resolved. There are 2 UN offices that are implemented in 2017. One is the Office of Missing Persons, and the other one is the Office of Reparations. Both of these offices are essentially inactive, and there's a real need to activate them in order to address the issue of disappearances. And locally right now, there's a big conversation going on about one of the torture chambers in which the previous president has some links with. This is the Batalanda torture chamber. And there's an Al Jazeera interview that he did in which he tries to absolve himself from any responsibility to this torture chamber. But not that this is something happened in 88, 89 period. There was a commission that looked into this torture chamber, and there's a report that has come out of it, and it's been tabled in the parliament more, recently, and there's a conversation going around that. But that's a separate. I mean, it's an integrated issue. So in terms of the safety, the NPP government is fair. I think it has released some of the political prisoners. I'm not sure if all the political prisoners are released, but they are making those efforts to build trust in this whole process. So as for the safety of those who might be returning, if the North and the East is still under a military colonization, you can't guarantee that. So we have to set the terms of any repatriation of refugees in terms of demilitarization of the North and the East. So this is an important issue in terms of establishing those, what Selaya essentially called reconciliation structures that enables these processes. But again, like I agree with what the previous speaker, the person who asked the question, said, that there shouldn't be any repatriation because the refugees have created communities and they live in the Australian context. It's not only an Australian issue, but it's a whole diaspora, a whole range of issues that affect other countries where the refugees have escaped into. So I think in terms of the safety issue, we need to talk about demilitarization. We need to talk about devolution and decentralization of powers, of state powers to the local regions to create that conditions of safety. I'll stop there.
Anybody else wants to comment on that question? Yes.
What the Australian government has done has been disgraceful of refugees. That's another issue. It was a 100-day silent vigil done by the Tamil refugees outside the Department of Home Affairs. And what the reports coming out was that the Tamils, who were basically really got citizenship, you've got to understand there's two waves of Tamils. The first wave, the Tamils were professionals. Second wave, they came out from the last phase of the Civil War, were not. And what the people running the vigil and the people who were at the vigil were saying is that they received no support from the Tamil community in Melbourne, and that's a shame. One of the participants, his name was Mana, he killed himself. I think he self-immolated. And there's been a number of cases where young Tamil men who've been traumatized by the war, basically because of they've been in limbo for a decade and a half, have basically taken their own lives in fear. And I need to put that across. So any Tamil that is supposedly repatriated to Colombo, and I don't know if it's been changed, they're immediately arrested by the security forces. They're made to disappear for a period. Some appear, some don't. Because Sri Lanka is dotted with the detention centers that we know nothing about. Also within the north, they had, and I don't know whether it's going to change, and it can change, if there's an economic model done by the security forces, I don't know, a number of human rights reports, where they basically kidnap young men, sometimes women, right? And they have their own torture techniques, which are too disgusting for me to go through. And then they either blackmail the families to get their release. They have to pay a certain amount of money. A lot of the people are poor, they can't afford it, right? And also what they do is they run a racket to help people escape Sri Lanka. But it's just a con job. They get caught and cut back. But nobody can take a boat outside the north without the Sri Lankan military knowing that they got a call them there. So these are important structural issues that need to be kept in mind. I don't expect the government maybe we can change it overnight, but they need to be aware of it. And the issue about the majority community, there's been a number of surveys. Right? What they said is there's a core group that are basically xenophobic Uber nationals. But the vast majority of Sinhalese are indifferent, and a small minority are concerned. And that's something that the government should build on. The ones that are being indifferent, they're more worried about their economic living. And the things that resonate with them is that the Tamils are taking their jobs. But that bullshit is being printed apart, and the government should take advantage of it. Anyway.
Sorry.
Please, Lionel.
Yeah, what is going on in that hole, I can't understand because there is a lot of echo and most of the questions I can't understand. But in the context of what Janaka said and Michael, from my understanding of what they were discussing about the refugee issue, well, I agree with what they spoke about. when the new government came to power, well, when president was elected in November or September last year, a delegation of us, I was included in that delegation. We made a suggestion to the government, to president, to release all political prisoners, and there was an issue with regard to how to do it, because sort of if they release Tamil political prisoners, then that will be taken up in the south by the Sinhala nationalists, and sort of that will create some antagonism within down south. So we suggested the ways to come out of that situation by appointing an independent board, judiciary board, to assess all the cases against people who had been held under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and also against although we cannot compare with what is going on with Tamil political prisoners, there are cases filed against some of the people who campaigned during Aragalaya, who took part in the Aragalaya campaign, and there are cases pending. A large number of cases, and government hasn't done anything with regard to those cases. And we said, they have to appoint some sort of an independent board rather than relying on the Attorney General to finalize everything. But I am concerned that they are not listening, and nothing has so far happened. I just wanted to convey that unless, as Janaka correctly said, unless the civil society is active and keep on pressurizing the government to implement what they pledged in their election agenda, I don't think there will be much that would happen. So.
Another question. Yes, please.
Just want to say.
Can you just come a bit closer to me, right? Then they can hear, right? No, you stay here. That's enough, right?
Thank you so much for it's so wonderful to be part of such a discussion with such learned, people who know all the doctors and activists. But is this on?
No.
Just wait.
Okay. And I just wanted to ask two questions, and they're related. There is a really deep embedded corruption, and I know that when the outgoing, I'm wondering to what degree are they still active politically and in place, and just a couple of layers maybe behind the scenes, and also what kind of geopolitical and trans-capital sort of counter-insurgencies are being funded at the moment. Because Sri Lanka, I'm always curious about to what extent the government even has this control, and they've always been geopolitical and economic interest from elsewhere. And I know there was a mention that Dr. Lionel said about China possibly going with China rather than the USA for tariffs and those capitalism changes. But what I'm asking is, who is funding any counterinsurgencies that we need to look for, and are they active members of the previous government still deeply embedded, only just out of view? Is that a question? I hope and just also enormous thank you. And before I start, just is there a way that we can keep, because I think diaspora involvement, if we can keep this conversation a little bit going, who do we go to say I want to do something?
So we will take that question, please.
Oh no, okay, well then that's okay.
Shall I?
Please.
I think the first question was what the government is doing around the issue of corruption. Is that right?
Yeah, it's deep, it's embedded, so it can't be going. Are there people still there, but just a little bit out of view?
Yes, because it's a multi-layered process, this whole corruption culture. So there are some interventions the NPP government is doing. One is the COPE committee, which is the Committee on Public Enterprise, which looks into corruption and waste of public funds in various bureaucracies. And one of the bureaucracies they recently looked at was the Youth Services, Ministry of Youth Services, and how funds from this ministry was used for political campaigning purposes. And so there are some publicly telecasted corruption investigations going. And also there are also the Justice Ministry through the AG's office trying to continue with some of these corruption cases, but the AG's office itself is also implicated in being partisan and being politicized over the past years. And there's a real need to build some sense of public trust within the AG's department. Within that, a public prosecutor's office is an imperative that the AG department needs to create, because this lack of a public prosecutor, which is an important aspect of the Australian government that needs to be discussed with the Sri Lankan counterparts about how to do a public prosecutor's office. So in terms of the corruption issue, that whole issue of public funding is one, but the other part of it is the issue of state violence. Over the years, these intricate webs of actors within state intelligence services, the military and the police networked among themselves and protecting each other in this process of maintaining a culture of immunity. So recently, the head of the Inspector General of Police went into hiding when he was asked to come to the courts, and he eventually produced himself in the court. But the police had to spend a few days trying to figure out where this the head of the police department was. So in terms of, there are multiple dimensions of this aspect of corruption that is getting played out at the moment, and NPP is trying to intervene in this process. What I can see is we're not going to be able to get rid of all corruption, or if we can come up with some kind of a managed corruption. And I think we need to look at the model of South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions over there, and how they managed to come up with some framework to gaining public trust in state institutions. So that's on the issue of corruption. On the issue of counterinsurgency in terms of trying to topple the NPP government, I think, yes, of course, the existing previous elites and the political elites are, devising multiple ways to try to create that. Counterinsurgency is a kind of a heavy word, but I would say a counter-hegemonic project in terms of trying to create a different narrative that undermines the current hegemony. So this is done in multiple ways. It doesn't have to be overtly violent or controversial. It can be done in much more nuanced ways within culture. For instance, recently a movie came about, it was called Rani, and it was about an abduction that happened during the 88-89 period, abduction and murder of a journalist called Richard de Souza. But the ways in which this movie created the storyline absolved the UMP government at the time from culpability in terms of their responsibility for that particular act of state violence. So it was done in a very subtle ways, just another movie, it's for entertainment purposes. And so but it does create that kind of counter narratives to absolve the previous authoritarian regimes of all those crimes that they have committed, and to create a new image, trying to assert itself in a new way. So rather than counterinsurgency, I would say it's much more about a counter-hegemonic project. How a government that is committed to some kind of a democratic transition is challenged, is constrained, it's resisted by vested interests who wants to return to a previous status quo. I will stop at that.
Thank you.
In light of what Janaka mentioned, I would like to add. I understood the question from the response Janaka provided. Sorry, I agree with what Janaka said basically, but I would like to bring to your attention some details about what is happening currently. Probably you remember in Australia, there was a case where I think it was PwC that was involved in the tax scandal with the Labour government. I think last 2 years or so, about 2 years back. And in Sri Lanka, now during the Rajapaksa days, PwC was very closely working with them, to cover up whatever the cases that would come up in terms of corruption. Now, the current government, I'm concerned because they have appointed Mr. Duminda Ulangamo. I don't have a case against this particular person, but he is working with what is the consultancy firm that's working with? I can't remember. I think it was again Ernst & Young. And he has been appointed as presidential advisor about financial aspects of governance. Now, exposing the whole government, all information about governance, what is happening with regard to tax bases and all that, if that information is accessible by consultants like that, I think there is a conflict of interest which the government doesn't seem to understand. When I look at some of the appointments that have been made recently, I am very concerned about the people because prima facie, there seems to be conflict of interest in what they are doing personally as business leaders, and then taking charge of some of the positions where they will administer government agencies dealing with those business. So, there is something which I don't understand. And about this intelligence matter, I personally know some of the people who have been appointed as private secretaries of some of the ministries and some of the ministry secretaries, who do not have a good character. And I have reported on those, but there doesn't seem to be any action. And there are allegations made against some of the people who have been appointed, as well as some of the people who have contested elections. And the very recent one, I don't know the truth behind this, but the government hasn't responded to these allegations. For example, one Tora Deniye, who is going to contest Gold municipal council elections, or who contested the last parliamentary election or something. Apparently, he was one of the people who shot at Rohana Vijayveera. And he is now in the NPP. And I don't know, whether he has confessed or whether he has made a self-criticism or anything. So there is so much of confusion of what the government is doing. I think that is why I said, they have lack of administrative experience, as well as, I am willing to excuse them for their inexperience, but they have to learn quickly how to tackle those issues. Otherwise, they will be in a soup. Thank you. Sorry.
Another question.
One question that I think is one of the key issues facing the country, which is the negotiate to renegotiate the loan, because as you know, can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Okay. I wanted you to give me, all three of you, give me your thoughts on the crucial issue facing Sri Lanka at the moment, which is the IMF loan and the austerity package. What are the chances of the government renegotiating a fairer loan? And if not renegotiating a fairer loan, how can they adapt their progressive issues to basically a very draconian financial package? Thank you.
Who's going to have a go at that question? The IMF loan. Yes, back to you.
Yes, I think you touched on the kind of the elephant in the room, which is debt restructuring. And the NPP, I mean, this goes to what Lionel mentioned earlier. Why some of these actors were appointed into the NPP was to gain trust with the IMF and the World Bank. So creating that network of trusted actors that the international financial institutions, particularly the IMF, is going to be able to negotiate with is part of that strategy, I think, Lana. But again, so this is the contradiction. You didn't try to, the NPP didn't try to say, we want debt cancellation or renegotiate the debt package at all. They went with what was given. And in order to do that, they had to get get the endorsement of the local capitalist classes and their, managerial technocratic elites in order to run that project. Now, I would, on the one hand, you can think, all right, if this is a strategic move in terms of a transitional project, okay, maybe after this, they will try to negotiate something different and create the conditions for a new kind of a much more socially responsible capitalist class to emerge within this process. But at the moment, like Lionel touched on, which is the key issue, there are so many questionable appointments within this process. But part of it is to gain that trust and to gain legitimacy with the international financial institutions and rating agencies. This is the ways in which the macroeconomy is run, by the ways in which the rating agencies are creating conditions so that the investors are, incentivized to come and invest here. But this doesn't have to be that way. We could have a different conversation. We could have a different narrative. But the NPP intellectual and the kind of political project underneath it lacks depth, lacks critical reflection. So I think that's the process for civil society and social movements to engage with the NPP to create that conversation, because there has always been a segment within the left, such as the Frontline Socialist Party, which has maintained debt cancellation should have been the main agenda. So they continue with that conversation about debt cancellation and trying to figure out a different process of negotiating with the debt restructuring process. But that conversation is marginal to the broader conversation. And this is where media matters. The ways in which popular media, which is dominated by private sector media, creates these conversations, is creating a sort of a neoliberal project that the NPP is essentially not in a position to really give a reflective criticism or to create an alternative conversation. So I don't see that alternative conversation coming within the NPP, but I think that needs to come from the civil society and forums like this to engage people differently when they're talking about debt restructuring. I'll stop at that.
Any more questions? Nothing nagging you at the back of your mind? No? Well, let me, I must say, as someone listening to you, the way it reads to me, who's by no means a specialist on Sri Lankan politics, is that there is this huge agenda facing the country and those who are in governance, but not painting, and the fact that you have such a change of government and large majority of the new party achieved in the parliament, etc. But I get the impression that the first few months don't quite point to the radical break that some may have hoped. And I ask that question because my experience from other countries is that the most radical performance from a new government committed to change comes in its first year, and then it becomes increasingly conservative. That's the general rule. It's very unlikely that it'll become increasingly radicalized as time goes on the law of probability. So let me ask you point blank, are you strongly encouraged by the initial moves of the new government, or are you just hoping against hope, with civil society perhaps taking the initiative, that better things are yet to come? How do you read it? What's happening and what might happen for the rest of this year? Yes, please.
Yeah, John, I think that's a really important issue. And the link between revolution and reformism, essentially in terms of you can have a revolution that gets reformist, but can a reformist government become revolutionary? And I think this depends on politics of hope and the ways in which civil society and social movements can deepen the conversation about democratic change in society. And I think you really touched on the issue. If you don't do something dramatic in the first year, you're not likely to bring around the voters with you. But at the same time, if the social movements underneath are having these conversations, are building a deeper sense of citizenship, I think you can push this NPP government into becoming more revolutionary or much more radical in terms of creating that democratic transition. So I think it needs help. It needs help from the global activist networks, linking with local networks, and also creating that conversation around how do you democratize a society when it's entrenched in authoritarian cultures, when it's entrenched in ethnonationalism, when it's entrenched in patriarchy and militarism. So it's a difficult struggle. We need to recognize the challenges, but we also need to build hope in terms of politics of hope that can maintain the spirit of Aragalaya. As Selaya said earlier, I'm also glad to have experienced that Aragalaya. And that spirit about citizenship, democracy, and sovereignty, I think needs to be revitalized in each of these conversations we have about democratic change in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you for that. This hopeful note, we should bring the. We should bring.
Yes, it's John.
It's not on.
Yeah, no, yeah.
On this more hopeful note, we should bring the discussion to a close. But of course, it's only the beginning of many more discussions to be held in weeks and months and perhaps years to come. And don't let's forget that the problems and challenges that Sri Lanka faces at this time are not unlike some of the. Yes.
Sorry, I thought we had to ask questions.
Yes.
But I have a comment.
Yes.
I mean, that's slightly different from what the speakers have said to you.
Okay. Well, why don't we have your comment?
Yeah.
And I'll close it after that.
Right.
Yeah. If you stand, it might be easier.
Oh, I see. I don't think I need that. I don't think.
Because other people need it. Because there are the audience in the other side.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Just get
So I am a Tamil from the north of Sri Lanka. And during the last elections, I campaigned for the Frontline Socialist Party led alliance. Okay, so basically, the LPP on its political agenda did not hold the promise to really transform Sri Lankan governance economy and society. It did not. Already, there are loads of key issues on which it had a very timid agenda. Because for years, they were honing themselves, they were developing themselves into a group that can become respectable and electable. That they abandoned a lot of their old, what should I say, left slogans, etc. So they had already started making compromises with the whole neoliberal establishment, even before the election. So that was a really problematic sign. And the other thing is the Aragalaya, the NPP, the main group, and the NPP, they really did not participate consistently because they were trying to keep themselves in this position of respectable electorate. They only participated in a marginal way. So it was a motley crew of people. I think the most interesting group there that led the Aragalaya was the Frontline Social Party, which is a tiny party, a group that's split away from the NPP, and then largely lots of independent groups, left intellectuals, individuals, trade unions, and all that. And the NPP always, they would participate in nationwide trade union action. They would always balk at because they were preserving themselves. And we knew that they were going to go for public-private partnerships, something that was hatched by Tony Blair in the UK, which is a very rich country, and it was a disaster. So we already saw the signs of them approaching, not making a break with this 2-3 decades long neoliberal economic development that has taken Sri Lanka down the road, into this current situation of economic crisis. And we knew that. One of the things that now they have a 2/3 majority in Parliament. And one of the first things that I would have done is to repeal the PTA, the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Acted in 1979. Purely to deal with the Tamil insurgency. Almost exclusively, Tamil youth were incarcerated, tortured, disappeared, thousands. And of course, the 87, 88, 89 period, the civil war also. So they can repeal the PTA more. They have 2/3 majority. They don't have to ask any questions. But they're not going to. They are going to think about, they are still telling us that they will want to refashion the PTA to become another anti-terror. We don't need an anti-terror law in Afghanistan. There's absolutely no need. We don't need it. It's because any kind of anti-terror law just completely suspects all manner of due process mechanisms. So these are all little indications. On the ethnic question, they are making tiny cosmetic gestures. When they were campaigning to be elected, they did not make any commitment on any devolution of power. Okay. Second thing is they said that they would not entertain any kind of war crimes investigation. I am somebody who is completely opposed to the Tamil nationalist lobby and the Tamil nationalists, particularly in the diaspora. Tamil nationalist lobby, I'm completely opposed to that. However, if you want to move on to reconciliation, there has to be some reckoning with the Tamil community and the Muslim community, the minorities, with regard to decades-long human rights violations against them. And the NPP made absolutely no statement in their agenda about that. These are two crucial things. So there are lots of little things like this. And of course, Lionel mentioned the appointments. The domestic debt restructuring forces ordered by the IMF, what they did? They, instead of taxing the rich, the very rich, they raided the pension funds of the poor, the poorest working class of Sri Lanka. The most disgraceful thing. And that is why they appointed that Ulangamur guy, the president of the Chamber of Commerce. So they have all these, they're stuck there. So what I'm saying is, this is a magnificent victory because they set the old guard home. the Rajapaksa, the Rani Vikramasinghe, and all of them went home. It was an advertisement. What are they going to do with it? That is the big problem. And the people, the real great heroes are the people of Sri Lanka who kicked the Rajapaksa first, and then he elected these people with so much expectation. And they are just muddying and pushing around. They should be, they're being very timid, terrified of India. They're terrified of the US and the IMF and BlackRock and all the sovereign bond holder companies. So if they are going to be like, I'm very worried if they really mess it up in 2028 when we start paying all our debts back, and there can be, people are predicting another huge financial crisis around that time. They will lose. And the right wingers will be back with a vengeance. So this is what I'm most looking for.
The next one, please.
Okay, well, thank you for that comment. And it reinforces the point I was making a little while ago, that you can place too much expectation on an incoming government, and you have to constantly place the emphasis not on government. That's my experience, but on the community, the society. It is they that make change, not government. Very rarely for a government to introduce progressive, transformative change on a large scale. Very, very rare. And you can't put all your eggs in that basket. So I'm hoping, personally, as a very interested observer, that the people of Sri Lanka will, through conversation, through narrative, and through some action, be able to mount the pressure that demands of those in government to keep performing better and more transformatively than they seem with the okay, so let me, closing on that note, thank you for the comment, and especially, of course, thank you to all our speakers who brought their perspectives and their hopes as well as their fears and anxieties for the future. And let's take from that the need for active engagement wherever one is, whether one is in Sri Lanka or in Australia or anywhere else in the world. We are part of the one global community that's trying to press for change in a transformative, compassionate, progressive, humane way. Thank you, and I know that there are some other thank yous to be mentioned, so I pass the microphone over to Michael.
Yes.
Michael, just come.
The French. All right, I've got to thank people.
Michael,
I'm sorry.
Michael, can you come a bit away from? No. Wait, the speaker. Just closer to the speaker.
Is this better?
That's,
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm just going to
just get a bit closer. Yeah, that's good.
I'm elderly, I'll be shaking again. All right. I just want to firstly thank the sponsors of this event, the Australian Advocacy for Good Governance, and some of the backroom people who helped to make this happen. One of them is a handsome gentleman with a hat on, Ron Guy. We did a lot of the networking and helping out. There's Marina Grayson, who's looking totally bored over there. We did a lot of the hard work. And there's Councillor Gaetano Greco, and the kind help. You were quite excellent, Marina, I must say, and my brilliant colleagues who basically illuminated a number of things. Now we're curious taking notes. And maybe the best was saved for the last. Thank you. Or maybe we'll have to draconian in being part of it if we ever have a second go. Okay, because I think it's one person need to be recognized. I want to thank all the speakers, and that's all I want to say. Not good enough.